I was looking for an acting class, and I asked a friend of mine, did he know of a good acting teacher in the area? And without hesitation, he said, Doug Taylor. So, but make sure you do it soon before he retires. This was 1992. And Doug is still teaching. I guess the odd thing was that it never occurred to me to ask, why Doug Taylor? But then that was probably just as well, because maybe if I had known anything about Doug, I wouldn't have been so casual about it. They were adult ed classes held in a basement at Fairfield University. The university didn't advertise those classes. The way you found out about them was the way I found out, which was by word of mouth. And I don't even think Doug promoted those classes. They were students who were not necessarily aspiring to be actors. And one thing I found out about people who discover acting classes later in life, myself included, they're usually going through some kind of transition. So they're open to something new, hoping to discover some new aspect of themselves. Or maybe find something that they left behind.
I had reached a point in my life, I had a career. I was working in a corporation, actually. I'm not sure I call that a career. But I was looking for something to do, and I believe a friend of mine had found an acting class.
I first met him in the mid-70s, probably. I was working community theater and floundering a little bit in a marriage and so on, and somebody said to me, there's this great movie seminar, Fairfield U, and it was at Canisius Hall. And I went, and there was a group of over 100 people in this hall. We were welcomed by a man named Doug Taylor, and he told us that night at 7 o'clock there would be a showing of a movie, let's say 2001, and someone associated with the movie would be there to talk with us afterwards. And indeed that night was Keira DeLay talking about 2001. There was a little break, and I said to someone, does anyone know of an acting class? And they pointed at Doug and said, he just started a class.
Almost everybody who's anybody in Fairfield County was taking Doug Taylor's class.
It's in this basement, and we go in there, and there's a ton of us. And there's this guy in there who has a beautiful voice. But I didn't know who he was. There's this class at Fairfield University, adult education.
A friend of mine who was taking a playwriting course with Doug asked me to come in and be one of the actors to read his draft, in a class. And when I get there, there's Arthur Coppett, who's been invited to sit in on it and comment on it. And here's Arthur Coppett, a famous playwright, sitting in on an adult ed playwriting class.
Mike Nichols, Arthur Miller, and he'd have one or two of the people in the class go to New York as a limo service kind of and pick the people up and bring them back to Connecticut.
You talk about, somebody takes, I'm going to take a computer class, I'm going to take this class. They go, they take it, they go back home, and it was just another class. Now, this touched people, touched something in them, where people really became connected. It was like a magnet, connected to the energy, and the energy was, it was exciting.
I knew nothing in the very beginning, nothing at all about his work, the world that he grew up and worked in.
He's not a big revealer of himself in terms of putting it out there to other people.
In class, sometimes he would hand out scenes, typewritten pages of a script. What I didn't realize was that a lot of those scenes came from things that he had written. One time, working with a scene partner, she told me that the scene we were working on was a scene from a play Doug had written that was on Broadway. He never said a word about that.
Occasionally I get to see his bio somewhere. He wrote for that, he acted in this, he wrote for that. I had no idea.
There was no Google when we started taking classes with Doug. And even if you Google him now, you won't find much. So who was this guy who seemed to know all these famous people? The quiet, patient, unassuming gentleman with a genius for bringing out all the people hidden inside you.
Ages ago in my college lit class, I was suddenly in love. She wrote poems. She wrote poetry. Byron, Keats, Shelley, Wordsworth, like that. And one day she leaned close to me in class and whispered one in my ear. I've never forgotten it. Yeah, she prefaced it with, Do you know what hope is? Well, her soft breath against my ear and her whispered words, I don't know, I guess I was entranced, and all I could do was just shake my head to the side, no, and let her words, her soft words seep into my being. Hope is a thing with feathers that perches on the soul and sings a tune without the words and never stops at all.
Doug's a storyteller. And lately he's been writing these one-person plays for himself. He's got one about tea with Shakespeare. He's got another one about King Lear. His monologue about a guy who falls in love literally with Emily Dickinson in a college lit class is brilliant and beautiful.
How'd I meet her? We're going to the college lit class, right? It was the very first session. The door wasn't quite open, and there was a crowd formed around the door, and suddenly she and I were pressed together. And we just stood there, without moving, staring into one another's eyes. Soon people began to brush against us. And I, without thinking, raised my hand with my palm open. And she laid her warm palm in mine. And we turned and walked into the room together with our hands joined. And she whispered a poem while we walked. Or part of one. I think she must have just written it. Because I could not stop for death, he kindly stopped for me. The carriage held just ourselves and immortality. Because I could not stop for death, he kindly stopped for me. The carriage held just ourselves and immortality. You know, I have no idea why she took the course. She probably could have taught it.
I am in awe of him. I would think that should I reach his ripe old age, and that I would like to be like him. Working on his performance in Lear at age 90 plus, and to me that's extraordinary, to be able to have the energy, capacity, and intelligence to do that at his age.
Tremble thy belly full, spitfire, spout rain, the wind rains under fire on my daughters.
I mean, there are people, distinguished people in the theater that I know that live here in Fairfield County, but none like Doug. Doug in his special room behind the garage in which he can sit and do and think and create is extraordinary.
I wanted to be a lawyer. I really wanted to be a lawyer. I wasn't a very good student in high school, but I got out, I graduated. So I went to junior college, and for the first 6 months, or maybe a year, I was in pre-legal, and I was scraping along, Latin, couldn't emotionally identify with it, what was going on, what I was getting in. I didn't know any other ways because I wanted to become a lawyer, I didn't know what else to do. And one day, it was like a veil lifted, and I thought, what am I doing? Why am I trying to be a lawyer, I mean, I can't do this stuff. I'm almost flunking out here. So I switched to, I guess you'd say, a liberal arts course. I switched to taking a lot of, speech and literature and things like that. And I moved from the following semester, I was on the Honor Society. Yeah, it went from that, from almost flunking out, to the Honor Society. And that was because why? I found what where I should really be, and these literature courses and Emily Dickinson and all the rest of them. I mean, they just tied in with everything I've always been struggling to do with poetry, because I love poetry long before that.
Yeah, speech impediment. That his mother took him to an elocutionist when he was a child to see if they could fix it. And part of the therapy was to give him poetry to memorize and recite. And so at an early age, Doug was memorizing and reciting poetry all by himself in his room to cure him of this problem.
Oh, for a muse of fire that would ascend the brightest heavens of invention, a kingdom for a stage, princes to act, and monarchs to behold the swelling scene. Then should the warlike Harry, like himself, assume the port of Mars, and at his heels, leased in like hounds, should famine, sword, and fire crouch for employment.
Doug was born and raised in San Francisco, in the Parkside district, about 30 blocks from the Pacific Ocean. He said from his window he could see a little piece of the Pacific Ocean.
That's my father and mother, Howard Taylor, and Arda DeZordo was her Italian name, and is my middle name. And if you just take the initials, it's DDT. Which always surprises me. It was a great neighborhood, and I had a lot of friends there. Jim Bravos, and I guess we were both 18 or 19 or whatever. He just bought a car. I was sitting out in the car with him, and the front door opened, and my mother came rushing out, and she said, "The Japanese have attacked Pearl Harbor. We're at war." And we were just stunned, you know. And I remember Jim saying to me, "I wonder how this is going to affect our lives."
When the war in Europe was over, Doug was an army sergeant in Austria. He was on a train in Paris on his way to the Pacific when the news came that Japan had surrendered. And strangely enough, that opened the door to his education in theater. The federal government set up some spontaneous universities in certain places in Europe. And one was Biarritz, a place on the Riviera full of grand hotels and casinos. And they turned those places into classrooms and dormitories so that the GIs could go to school to get a head start in their education before they came back. And the GIs could go for free, and they could study anything they wanted. You could study engineering, you could study physics, you could study theater. So you had Marlene Dietrich teaching acting, you had famous Broadway directors that were brought over. It only lasted for that 1 year, 1945. But Doug Taylor's one of those people that went there. He studied theater. He actually performed in plays there.
Guthrie McClintock came over to direct Winterset, and I ended up playing the leading role after a little. Guthrie McClintock was Catherine Cornell's husband and director. He had directed major Broadway productions. He encouraged me to go into the professional theater. So he suggested I go to the neighborhood playhouse, where Martha Graham, he was very close to Martha Graham, taught dance.
Went to New York, and he enrolled in the neighborhood playhouse and started studying acting with Sanford Meisner, one of the most influential acting teachers of the 20th century.
I was living in a cold water flat, across the street from the neighborhood playhouse. I had 3 rooms, one, the front room and the kitchen, and a little tiny bedroom. I slept on the floor, me and a rat. The rat became my buddy, and and he used to be there every night and run on top of me, and I'd push him up in the air, and I don't know how I got to be friends with this rat, but I did, and we got along pretty well.
And he never even thought about, this is a rat. You're in New York, man. Get rid of it. Get some rat poison. Not even a concept for him. But I remember there was a romantic interest that indicated that a rat and her life around her was not compatible. So he had to somehow get rid of this rat. But Doug didn't want to kill the rat. So he said he had someone come in and put up, I don't know what it is, but around the pipes, and so that the rat could not come into the house anymore, into his apartment. And he said it killed him to hear that rat scratching on the walls because it could no longer come and visit Doug.
Doug's first professional role was in 1948 in a comedy starring Uta Hagen. Later he became a member of the group theater where he formed friendships with actors like Morris Garnowski and Phoebe Brand.
I worked with Bobby Lewis, and I worked with Harold Klarman, with Lee Strasberg, and anyway, I've been exposed to that approach to acting on many levels.
In the 50s, he was appearing in television dramas.
Major Gaylord, those men don't stand a chance across that river. And I want to know whose decision it was to send them across.
My decision. You satisfied?
How about another patrol to hunt for them?
Negative.
Look, just a couple of men and myself.
Negative.
then.
I can't spare a couple of men now.
You could spare 20 yesterday afternoon.
That was yesterday afternoon.
Begging your pardon. Don't beg my pardon, Jones.
Speak your piece and get back to your company.
My company's 5 effectives, 40 litter cases. The rest are flat on their face for 3 miles up the road.
You know, I went to the neighborhood playhouse and studied with Sandy Meisner, right, Sanford Meisner. And I thoroughly absorbed his technique, the method, if you want to call it that, his version of the method. And I now have my version of the method. But nevertheless, I was with an acting ensemble. And we toured the country in a truck. I drove the truck, but I also performed in the plays. There was a playwright in that company, and we ended up doing her plays. Actually, we were the first ones to perform at Lucille Hotel's Playhouse here in Norwalk. I happened to give the playwright something I had written, and she gave it, she liked it. And she said, I'm going to give this to my agent. And the agent sent it to David Susskind. And the next thing I knew, she called me and said, they want to do your play. The first play I wrote that was really a significant play was Five in Judgment.
Featuring Paul Newman, Jack Lord, and James Gregory. Later he wrote an hour-long drama for an actor he discovered off-Broadway, Jack Klugman. Time for Love featured John Cassavetes and Gina Rowlands in their first on-screen appearance together. Doug wrote about 30 of those studio dramas that were broadcast live on TV. And New York was the center of that at the time.
And the New York writers really stemmed from theater. Most of our points of view were very, very ingrained in drama, in drama. Not in film, in drama. So we were bringing drama to television. So I think I was basically writing plays all the time. I remember David Susskind saying, how do you write something like this?
That's my question.
It was, well, I don't know how you write something like that. You sit down, you start writing. Yeah. And I mentioned the neighborhood playhouse and Sandy Meisner because that technique of personalizing and using yourself in a creative way really fed into the way I wrote plays. I never really separated my acting technique that I learned from Sandy Meisner and developed through Sandy Meisner. I never really separated that, and I still don't from the writing that I do. Poetry, I think, fed me when I wrote, because I could see, and being an actor, I could see my characters, and they sort of, I don't know, they sort of create their own situation. Of course, it's coming from me, but it's coming from my characters.
And the television industry moves from New York to Los Angeles. And that meant Doug had to make a choice whether he was going to go with it.
I remember eventually they said, if you want to write for us, you're going to have to live here. So I said, so long Hollywood. I was tremendously influenced by Thoreau. The gold rush in California broke out. And somebody asked him, why haven't you gone to California? He said, why should I go to California? It's just 3,000 miles closer to hell.
He lived out in California for some time, though. I think he knew California, and he knew that wasn't where he wanted to be, I think.
Then I sat down and wrote Horst Johnson, The Re-Education of Horst Johnson, and I wrote it for Jack Klugman, who had been in an hour show of mine.
This was Doug's first full-length play. A warehouse worker sees his friend die suddenly of a heart attack, and he starts asking himself, what's it all for? What's the meaning of life? So he leaves his job and immerses himself in literature, philosophy, transcendentalism, and the poetry of Walt Whitman.
Transcendentalism had a tremendous influence on my life, and it emerges in my writing, I'm sure, and lots of places where I don't even realize it's there. It has to do with the essence of life, of nature, being all of us being such an integral part of nature. Of course, I identified with it because I was in love with poetry. I identified with poetry and what poetry was about. And a lot of poetry is about, the essence of what you are and not the complications of all the materialistic things.
But then Horst Johnson takes it too far. He begins to think that he's discovered some secret truth about the universe, and that he's a prophet. The play was developed at the Eugene O'Neill Center in Waterford, Connecticut, starring Jack Klugman, Kathleen McGuire, and Jill Clayburgh. It had its world premiere at the Milwaukee Repertory Company in 1966, and in the fall of 1968 it opened on Broadway. Although by the time it got to Broadway, I think that it got away from him. What went on the stage was not the play that he intended. And also, unfortunately, it was advertised as a comedy, which it isn't. I mean, there's a lot of humor in it, and there's a lot of humanity in it, but it's not a comedy. And I think the critics took it at its word. It was a comedy that they didn't find very funny.
Horst Johnson was a bit of a blow, an ego blow, in a way. Maybe it was a realization. Maybe it was there's a silver lining in that ego blow, because maybe he wouldn't have been a teacher, or he wouldn't have gone. So I always look for the positive side and what's the silver lining here.
Okay, first got to back up and say that in 1961, Doug married Barbara Baxley, an actress who had also gone to the Neighborhood Playhouse. She's probably best remembered for her roles in Norma Ray and Nashville. 1961. She's working with Tennessee Williams, who adored her, and she was up for a Tony Award for her role in Period of Adjustment. And she was like a close friend and a muse, let's say, to William Inge, who actually wrote some roles for her. When she married Doug Taylor, I guess William Inge was angry about it and cut her off for a long time. Doug continued to have plays produced off-Broadway and at regional theaters. Making It was directed by Rod Steiger at the Actors Studio, and it was later produced at Milwaukee Rep as Oh Pioneers, along with another play of his, That's the Game, Jack, a play about the civil rights movement.
Hey, I want you to share the story that's in that play that has the March in Washington embedded in it. What's the name of that play?
That's the Game, Jack.
Yeah. Tell us about that, because there's a character in there that I know is you taking that bus.
At that moment when I wrote that, it was me saying that, Using yourself is very important in playwriting. I don't know that I ever wrote a play that I didn't really identify with emotionally.
Tell us about where you were when Martin Luther King gave that speech.
Frankly, the speeches that were being made were interesting, but they were just speeches, I began to work my way through the crowd and around the side of, going toward the Lincoln Memorial. And there was platforms there with mics and all that. And I worked my way around behind, and when he gave that speech, I was sitting under Lincoln's statue. Nobody else was there. I was there. But I could hear the speech, of course. Also, I looked over on my side at one point, and there was a door. And that door opened, and a couple of three people walked out. And one of them
was Marlon Brando. And he was dressed, oddly enough, in a brown suit and tie, which I had never seen him in. I saw him on the stage numerous times. But there he was, Marlon Brando, standing there. And they were saying to him, I think they were indicating to him, that it would be all right if he went up on the platform. And he just shook his head no and left. So anyway, I was sitting there. You asked me that question. I was sitting there when he said, I have a dream.
You recognized right away that it was different from the other speeches that you were hearing?
It just grabbed everybody. It just grabbed that crowd of thousands of people out there. It just grabbed him. They he just held them spellbound, and their reaction to it, of course, was tremendous. I don't think any of us realized the significance of what had happened in Washington, because it was suddenly fabulous. Everybody was talking about this March on Washington, where we were. And my then wife was in a play. She was a brilliant actress. She was in rehearsal for a play. And she, with great pride, said, my husband was there, you know. And we were there because we felt it was important to be there. But we had no idea that it was going to sweep the country. Oh, and had swept the country in terms of reaction to it. Why are we going on with this thing? You asked me about the play. Oh, yes.
We'll be sitting there doing some scene work, and he'll spit out, Uta Hagen! And like, what? And then he goes and has a story about Uta Hagen. And he has stories about, Joanne Woodward. He just knows so many people. And it's never, I'm going to drop names. It's all of a sudden the memory comes back, and it's a rich story. And I hope we all are rich stories now in Doug's life. Doug has done a great deal to enrich our lives, and now we are part of his story, and he's part of our story.
Doug and Barbara bought a house in Weston, Connecticut, next door to Westport, only a short train ride from New York. Nearby in Wilton, their neighbors included the Brubecks, Dave and Eola Brubeck, who Barbara had known since college. Westport at that time was famous as an artist community, a community that had a kind of artistic, creative energy that they shared with each other.
Joanne and Paul and Charles Gioffi and Lee Richardson and all these actors who were working actors who lived in Fairfield County, who worked at the Shakespeare Theater or worked at Westport, or were also working in New York. Sandy Dennis was one of his close friends, and he became the executor of her estate, and he even performed doing plays with her locally. It was all a kind of nice community here, and it was ideal for him.
In the early 70s, a college professor named Mel Hornick got an idea to start an adult ed academy modeled on the new school, in which students would study subjects taught by masters. And the masters were the people who lived in that area.
This fellow said, standing there in our doorway, and he said, my name's Mel Hornick, and Dave Brubeck thought that my wife, Barbara Baxley, who was really a well-known theater actress, that she might be willing to teach a course. Well, she couldn't. She was busy doing things. But I who always wanted to teach acting, I said, well, if you want, I'll try it. Well, it just took off. I had 35 people in the class, and it just kept going, and I became a moving force in the school along with Mel.
Classes were held at the Westport Country Playhouse and also at the Westport Town Hall.
For 1 or 2 summers, we had classes in his barn. Sam Mink was there, and Sherry.
My wife had also been involved. I didn't know her at the time. That's where I met her. She had been involved in the classes too.
It was like a nice time. We would go out there, and a lot of people would come, and we would have classes in the barn.
Joanne Woodward said to Doug, we should do a show together sometime. And so he came up with this traveling show called Jazz, Poetry, Jazz. Featured himself, Joanne Woodward, Barbara Baxley, and Darius Brubeck. I read that they collaborated on this in the children's treehouse on the Newman's backyard.
I remember Joanne Woodward coming up in her station wagon or whatever it was, for rehearsal, and that's where they put it on. That was the first place they put Jazz, Poetry, Jazz on. It was at that Westport Town Hall, and then they toured, I think.
So at some point, Doug is looking for another place to perform Jazz, Poetry, Jazz, and he calls up Fairfield University and he says, "Do you want the show?" And they say, basically, yes, and we'd like your School of Continuing Ed as well. And the school became based at Fairfield University in 1974.
I went to the basement of this place at Fairfield U, and Doug was on one side of the room observing his then wife, Barbara Baxley, and she made several caustic comments to people in the class. "Why are you here? Why are you sitting with your legs crossed? Oh, and you must be a wasp, because only wasps sit that straight." And on, and I thought, oh my goodness, maybe this class isn't for me.
Barbara Baxley, I met her a number of times. She wasn't the friendliest person. Mm-hmm. She just wasn't a warm, fuzzy person.
People said about different acting teachers that they took your spirit away, or they guided you in such a way that you had no breath.
I've been told about a number of teachers that their whole method is to tear you down. You're going to scare them out of there. They're not coming back. You're going to wound those people.
And then Doug, of course, having a manner in which he's very laid back, started by saying, "You don't need a lot of brains to do this, so relax."
He had a self-confidence, and he just shared that with you.
He always was supportive and encouraging.
That's why people love him, because he always accentuated that and made you feel like you were worthy.
I never heard him ever say to anyone that something wasn't good. If something wasn't great, he would say, "That had good life." Good life was code for, that really needs some work.
One of the first things that I remember doing in his classes was what he called repetition exercises, which, at first seemed like, what? What is this? You just repeat whatever the other person said to you. Hi, 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 hi. And it took your having to think about the words you were saying, took that out of the picture. And I think the whole point of it was so that you would be focusing on what's the other person doing? What are they radiating towards you? What are they communicating towards you?
And now I know, all these years later, why that was so key, and I would say, "Oh, Doug, not repetition again," but I get why he did it.
Because intellectuals are up in their head, and as you know, if you're an intellectual, you can't act. Because you're in your head. You're not in the moment, you're not living off the energy of the other person.
Repetition exercises, improvisation.
We'll do an improv that's very similar to the scene that we're doing, and then we'll have the life of that, and then we'll go right into the scene.
We would do improvs, we do scene work, gritty stuff. And we'd go pretty late at night. We'd go to midnight frequently. Yeah. And Doug, he's alive. Midnight. He's fully loaded. The rest of us have to go to work the next day. And we did that for years.
He'd call me up next day or that night. He goes, Glenn, we need to work on that scene. I'll see you Saturday. Get your partner and I'll meet you over at the studio on Saturday. And we went over there, and he would put his time and effort for no money. He wasn't making money off of this. He did this out of pure love. That's another aspect that made him, in my mind, such a great teacher. Because he would we'd meet over, he'd spend hours with us.
It wasn't only about the work. It was about if you came in and said, "I'm having a lot of trouble in my marriage," or "Someone I know is dying, and I blah, blah, blah," and he would say, "Let's go to coffee. Let's go to coffee and talk a little bit." And so there was that part of it which made you stronger, which in turn was able to let you focus more on your work. And for that, it's a gift, it's really a gift that not everybody can give us.
Doug used actors that he trained to create an acting company and began performing plays at the little theater on the campus at Fairfield U. This meant that the students from the adult ed acting classes could now apply what they learned in actual theater productions.
And it was a gem, and it had dressing rooms and a little box office that they made up, and every summer Doug gave 3 or 4 plays.
I think between 1976 and 1991 or 92, I think there were about 55, 56 plays. I mean, there were a lot of plays that were put on.
So we rehearsed practically every day during the summer, and our lives just fell apart at home, or lovers, or friends. It just didn't exist.
There was camaraderie in that group because those people had gone through classes together.
I remember doing a scene with a girl named Louise Ladd, who was in the class, and it was the prime of Miss Jean Brodie or something. And in this little area that we did our scenes, there was also a little room upstairs, and you could rehearse there. So Louise and I went upstairs, and we started rehearsing, and she looked at me and she said, "I love Doug." And I said, "Yeah, I love him too. It seems like everybody is so fond of him and really gets him, And she said, "No, I love Doug, and he loves me." There started a relationship which I think lasted over 40 years.
And I was in the class that he met Louise. I mean, that was around 1974, I believe. She was married, and she had 3 kids. And, she ended up getting divorced, and Doug adored Louise.
Louise shared Doug's love of the outdoors. She had a wicked sense of humor. She was a gifted actress and a writer. Later, she taught creative writing at the university. She was the love of his life and an essential part of his acting company.
I created the acting ensemble, and she helped me run it. But she also participated in it.
That acting company was cooking. Louise was producing them. Doug was directing them. Sometimes other people would direct, like Mark Terrazzo. Mark Terrazzo was a big part of that whole process. And Mark would sleep there. He'd sleep there in an old smelly blanket. He would work the set. He would work the lights.
He always managed to put together and sort of hold together a group of people, sometimes a pretty weird group, and sometimes a lot of crazy behavior.
Had a very eclectic group in the basement of Fairfield U. There were people who were angry, people who were maybe addicted, sad people. Sometimes they would take out anger in a scene, and he would say, that's really good, but no pushing, no hurting. And if you use a knife or a gun, hold it down, always for safety.
Doug gave me the opportunity to play a certain amount of lead roles, like one was the 3 Men on a Horse, Patsy, the gambler. And that fit me like a glove. It's like, wow, man, this is cool, this is easy. You're just, I just let my personality just go and just kind of, learn, you got the whole thing going. But if I hadn't had that experience, I wouldn't know what it felt like to mesh with that character so much, where it was like, it was just one.
Doug is a wonderful master at taking what someone is and really kind of building them up. And I say deconstruct because we always go in there acting, and then he backs us off that. And then he slowly builds us up so that what we become is who we are. And that expression is seen on the stage.
Eventually, Fairfield U squeezed him out, and he wasn't doing productions anymore. His classes moved to the Crystal Theater in Norwalk. The people who were comfortable with Doug, who kept, who learned so much from Doug, kept coming back to his classes. So he had people taking those classes for years. I mean, some of them now are students that were with him from the very beginning.
I still see him once a week or so. We do a monologue class on the weekends, and we do scene work on the weekdays. And I still sit there and marvel at this person who's so committed, 95 years old, committed to this craft, committed to his community.
A poem. I'm writing a poem. All I've got so far is one word. Yes, one word. lugubrious.
Doug had another outlet for his creative energy in a local group of professional actors called the Theater Artists Workshop.
The Theater Artists Workshop is sort of as a gymnasium for actors, writers, and directors. Doug was a founding member. This was a place where he could act and he could have his plays explored and worked on.
I was the artistic director and director of the Bare Bones Theater at the Pequot Library, which was a staged reading series. Doug was one of the guest playwrights. He actually asked if he could put up on stage a couple of plays that he had written that he wanted to revisit.
We did readings of Horace Johnson. We did readings of Making It. I directed him in a reading of that. He directed me at another time. In 2003, I teamed up with filmmaker Michael Stanley to make a comedy about a community theater. I wrote a part in it for Doug, a character called Arden Sherwood, who was a famous director.
Oh my God, you are Arden Sherwood. You're a member of the group theater.
Oh, shit.
You know, I read your book.
It's a community theater out in the middle of nowhere, and they have on the board this once famous exiled Broadway director who they keep in the corner. Nobody really knows or cares much about his accomplishment.
Hell are we talking about?
Order.
I said, what the hell?
Of order. The chair recognizes Arden Sherwood.
I included some inside jokes that I thought Doug would appreciate.
I once asked Sandy Meisner.
Oh, God. Not another Meisner story.
What'd you ask him?
Sandy, why do we take our make-believe so seriously?
What did he say?
We're make-believe. Why do we take ourselves so seriously?
My dear, if you hang around long enough, you'll hear from all of them. Strasberg, Stanislavski, Karnowski, Adler.
So many Jack Russians.
In the old days, I had a theater in the city with a group of actors and directors. Used to spend the summers out here. And somebody got the idea to start an artist colony. It galvanized me. Get away from the politics, the egos, the commercial garbage of New York, and start again clean, close to nature. A theater of the people. I put almost all the money I had in this place. I built it with my own hands.
You must be proud.
Shows, huh, kid?
I mean, it is a theater of the people, isn't it?
What are you, a wise ass?
They need an actress to fill the part in their Agatha Christie play, and she doesn't want to do it.
He said, you know, I have this idea, can I do this? And so we set it up, and he just went into this monologue from Shakespeare, and my jaw just dropped.
Oh, that this too solid flesh would melt, thaw, and resolve itself into a dew. Or that the everlasting had not fixed its cannon against self-slaughter, violent, fie! 'Tis an unweeded garden that grows to seed, things rank and gross and nature possessed. Merely spare me, spare me, spare me.
Arden figures out a way to seduce this young woman into taking the role. You see Doug's artistry working not only as an actor but as a writer, creating a pivotal moment in the story. I mean, almost as amazing as Doug's performance in it was the fact that I could say to him, "Hey Doug, you want to be in my movie?" And he said, "Sure."
I told him I wanted to be able to reach people that I didn't have any connection, I didn't know how to reach them. And he said, take my address book. And I saw addresses in there, I mean, Mike Nichols and agents and all these, from over, I think it's the same address book that he probably had for 40 years. Doug just comes to my shows, and some of those shows have not been easy for him to get to, and he comes. And he doesn't just come and then say, oh, very nice job. He has things to say, and he talks to me as if I'm a colleague. And that is
is a huge honor for me. He talks to everybody that I've been able to observe as if they're friends of his, colleagues of his. That ideal of the dignity of the ordinary person, he confers that on everyone.
Similarly, his plays are full of empathy for ordinary people, human dramas with a social conscience. But Doug doesn't write plays with themes in mind. He writes from inspiration and heart.
It was back in the early 50s. I lived in a cold water flat. I'd moved from one that cost $5 a month upstairs to a fancy one that cost $35 a month. Anyway, right in that period, I began to sell TV scripts. I was on my way to a story conference. I was always fascinated by what was going on my street. It was East 54th Street, over near the river. And this bus pulled up, this yellow bus. It was kind of an old bus. It was transporting girls to the across the street where I used to go periodically for a shower and a swim. What happened was that these girls had all gotten out of the bus and gone inside, except somehow, I guess one of them got away and ran. I didn't see her running away. What I saw was our street cop, who was he wasn't the greatest guy in the world. He was a really kind of yo-yo cop, but there were a lot of wonderful policemen. But nevertheless, he was bringing this girl back to one of the attendants who was in white, all dressed in white, and the girl was in tears and crying. There was something about her and what was going on with her that I couldn't get out of my mind. I kind of I don't know, when I think back on it, I feel like I fell in love with her, just watching her, and I identified so deeply with her plight. I knew she wanted to get away and escape whatever was going on. And so eventually I sat down and I started to write this film. I said to myself, what would have happened if she got away?
Who's this?
Mitch. It's me, Naomi.
Naomi? They let you phone?
No, I'm out.
What do you mean out?
I ran away. I made it. I'm out.
You're crazy. What'd you do that for?
I need to talk to you. I gotta see you. Tell you something.
Yeah? What?
I gotta see you to tell you.
Tell me what, Naomi? Just tell me what.
I'm gonna have a baby. What should we do?
Do? Look. You sure it's my kid? Where are you? I'll come and get you. Where are you, Naomi? Hey, you ain't careful, the cops can grab you again. Tell me, I'll come for you.
Go to hell, Mitch.
The first title was A Girl Who Stamped on Air, and it came from a poem by Emily Dickinson. Of course I cried. Did God care? He cared as much as if a bird on air had stamped its foot and cried, "Give me."
She's in Coney Island.
I did not have a planned script in my mind. Why is she in Coney Island? Because that's where she went, and I went there with her.
Coney Island's traditionally a refuge for outlaws and misfits. And here the street kid gets a chance at a new life with a new identity. With Pete, a mechanic who works at the amusement park, and his aunt who runs an Italian restaurant. Pete, a combat veteran, saves her from being assaulted by a gang of street thugs. He tries to take her to a hospital, but she won't go.
He takes her back and takes her to Olivati, to her apartment, which is above a restaurant that she runs.
Hey, Aunt Rosa.
You don't know her name?
Found her at the concessions.
You found her. She was lost?
It's a long story, and I have to work in the morning.
Oh, you have to work? What, I'm on vacation? Why don't she go home?
I took her home. They don't want her.
What's that mean?
Stepmother's a cockroach and her father's a jellyfish. Stepmother slammed the door in her face.
And Olivati goes up, and pretty soon she's helping her. And she becomes a part of the function of the restaurant.
They like being a waitress?
like Olive Bobby. She's different.
Different?
She likes people.
So lots of people like people.
Name me a couple.
You want to know something? You're not that tough. Just pretend to be tough.
You've been watching me or something?
Oh no, just got hunches. How come you read so damn much?
Makes me feel close to my mother. She used to read to me every night of my life till I was 8.
Then what happened?
And she died.
She was a teacher, right?
Right. She's a teacher.
Pete wins her a doll at a shooting gallery. Later she finds out that he's involved with a married woman.
I'm Ann Carter. Pete works for my husband. Do you remember me? I'm
Ann Carter.
Oh, how nice of you to remember.
I named my doll after you.
Did you? Well, I'm flattered.
But I renamed her Penelope. I don't know what's with that swanky chick, okay? But if you're so curious, don't ask me. Ask her the next time you're...
Next time I'm what, huh? Didn't I tell you that... You jealous of her or something?
Ultimately, Naomi's journey is a brief escape in which she discovers herself and a family that she never had. And before her past catches up to her, she manages to save Pete from himself.
She has a line in the film when the matron that finds her on Coney Island has her rearrested, says, "You've changed, haven't you?" And Naomi says, "Yes, I've changed. I'm not the same person I was at all. I didn't know who I was. I found people who loved me."
I think that he is carrying on the American romantic tradition, the commitment to democracy and progress and equality, drawing inspiration from nature and from ordinary people, and celebrating a kind of quest that some people discover that they're on, not only to find themselves, but to find a way in which they can make their lives meaningful, looking for an anchor and looking for a destination.
One of the things that's interesting about writing, and also acting, is that you discover things about yourself when you're writing that you never knew existed. And that same thing is true of the acting technique. For example, Louise, she decided she wanted to try to write something, and she wrote this kind of fantasy thing. Her immediate family at that point thought it was funny that she was trying to write something, and they laughed at her doing it. But she showed it to me. It was not very good, but it was there. And so I encouraged her to write something else and to go on writing. And she became a writer. Now, she never would have become a writer if she hadn't been in that workshop and studied that technique, because she had 14 books published. She had a lot of things happen to her as a writer. She's now an editor. And people bring their novels to her to edit. Did she have this going on before she came and studied the method? No. The method put her in touch with herself, with aspects of herself that she never knew existed. And that's called the creative process. And emanating eventually what we call spiritual overtones. And Sandy calls it that. But very few people, I think, understood that aspect of the technique. And that is that it brings you so involved in what you are doing, and so using yourself so fully and with such tremendous concentration that you emanate spiritual overtones because you are totally involved in what you are doing. And that applies also, I think, to writing. The characters and you have merged into this form.
It's an integration of the mind, the body, the emotions, and the spirit into a unity. When that integration happens, you're really a channel. You're a channel for a higher creative energy. Some people call it universal energy, creative energy. Some people call it God. Some people call it, there's a lot of terms for it, but it's still energy. And I think really you're real good artists, and that means a painter, a dancer, a writer, an actor. They're basically a clean channel for this energy just flowing through them in the moment and letting it happen.
And of course, emanating spiritual overtones, which I don't think Stanislavski ever used that phrase. It was just an avenue of approach. And everybody has to make it their own, so that their inner creative self, which is in every single person, emerges.
Whose is this now? This is yours?
When you think about his background, he's so humble. I hadn't studied with him for a couple years, so I go back to the Crystal Theater. And I'm a little bit older, a little bit more life experience. And he yet pulls more out of me that was in there that I didn't even know was in there.
I stayed with Doug for about 4 years, and then I got accepted to the USC Film School. I went away to California, had a whole career in TV for 15 years. And then I moved back to the East Coast, and I thought, what if Doug Taylor's still teaching acting? I called him up, and Doug was going strong. And now he had a whole new cadre. And Doug has probably mentored, I would say, easily in the hundreds of people.
A number of years ago, in the middle of one of our acting semesters, my father was diagnosed with cancer. And during that time, the firm that my father had started with two partners was celebrating its 30th anniversary with about 800 guests at the Museum of Modern Art. And my father had asked if I would go there and speak in his place. Presence and the ability to be in the moment that I had learned in his class. And I realized that if acting was really doing, then doing was really doing. And if I went and acted like a woman who knew what she was going to say and was comfortable speaking in front of 800 people, then I was going to be a woman who was comfortable in front of 800 people. And it really worked.
It's a growth therapy. You could look at it as, well, it's training for an actor. But it's really a growth therapy of training of the person, of them becoming a human being, of being in touch with themselves and using themselves. And that was evident in a lot of the people that have come through Doug's classes who didn't become professional actors.
I facilitate focus groups, and which is, that's acting 101 every day. I'm sitting with groups of people. And that work with Doug made my business explode. There is nothing that I've done that has impacted my life more than that. Just taking those classes, becoming more real, being in the moment all the time. That's such a powerful way of being and practicing it.
The poem that's central to the play, The Re-Education of Horace Johnson, is part of Walt Whitman's Leaves of Grass. It's a small section that begins, "The spotted hawk swoops by me." And generally it's often discussed as a separate poem. But I think maybe I can use it as a way to talk about what seems to be Doug, for me anyway. He talks about going to school to become a lawyer and then realizing that was the wrong thing to do, and then taking some literature classes and suddenly feel as if he's discovered what's important to him. And the last line of the Spotted Hawk section says, "I stopped somewhere waiting for you." I think it's kind of a teacher's mission. An effective teacher may wind up being remembered either as a person or as an idea for generations. That piece is a living thing, and it's passed forward and it incorporates itself with other parts of the person who remembers. Teachers are the only people who live forever. That's my idea. Now, Doug seems to be willing to, and I think it would be wonderful if he did live forever as well. But in terms of the lives that he's touched, and genuinely touched, not come into contact with, but generally touched, he's all over the place. And a lot of those people are in positions where they can pass that insight or that intimacy or that vision or that character trait forward into another generation.
The spotted hawk swoops by and accuses me. He complains of my gab and my loitering. I too am not a bit tamed. I too am untranslatable. I sound my barbaric yarp across the roofs of the world. Failing to fetch me at first, keep encouraged. Missing me one place, search another. I stop somewhere waiting for you.